None of the accused denies that 2,000 gallons of highly poisonous liquid was dumped in an unlicensed tip in Seddon Quarry near Fulchester in contravention of last year's Deposit of Poisonous Waste Act. A couple of contractors, Albert and Martha Cousins, who deposited the liquid, claim they were told it was harmless. Michael Mays, the transport manager of Fulchester Metals, however, claims he told them that it was toxic, and they assured him they would dispose of it legally. The prosecution has suggested there is a further possibility, that all are guilty of conspiracy. Albert Cousins is being re-examined by his counsel, Miss Gibson.
Mr. Cousins, have you dumped any toxics in the quarry since the Act?
No.
Now, how long has the toxics part been shut off?
Well, months anyway.
So it can hardly have been a surprise to you to find it shut.
I knew it already.
Thank you, Mr. Cousins.
Well, Mr. Cousins, you may return to the dock.
Thank you, my lord.
I call Mrs. Martha Edith Cousins.
What's the two geezers?
What is your religion?
C of E.
Take the testament in your right hand and read aloud the words on this card.
I swear by Almighty God that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
You are Mrs. Martha Edith Cousins?
Yes.
And you live at 15 Hathaway Crescent, Fulchester?
Yes.
Mrs. Cousins, how many children do you have?
4 girls, 3 boys.
A family of 9.
Well, there wasn't all that birth control when we were first keeping our feet warm of a winter's night.
And you still find time to help your husband with his business?
Oh, don't get tired just by being up all day.
Do you all help? Your children too?
If they want to eat, them that works gets fed till they leave home. Then they've got to buy their own toothpaste. My 2 eldest are married now.
A loving and very close family.
Yeah, that's right.
Mrs. Cousins, up to this time, have any of you ever been in any trouble with the law?
Oh, I'd have the skin off their bums.
Your husband's included?
Oh, that would be a fair match, that would. I've never had a stand-up knock-downer with him. No, I handle him a bit different.
How do you handle him?
Well, he likes his feed, likes a bit of cuddle. He steps out a line and the world goes all cold and hungry on him. Right, Albert?
Is he warm and well-fed presently?
Fat as butter, if it's any of your business.
You've no complaints against him?
Oh, he's all right, whatever the neighbours say.
Oh, what do the neighbours say?
My old man's a dustman. Well, I suppose he is, really. I wouldn't swap him, though.
Mrs. Cousins, would you lie for him?
Damn right I would.
You would?
What, wouldn't you? Wouldn't you lie for your old man?
But are you lying for him now?
No.
Or for yourself?
No.
Now, you were present during the whole meeting with Mr. Mays.
All the time.
Did he at any time tell you that the liquid waste was toxic?
No, he said it wasn't toxic, and he showed us that list.
Mr. Mays clearly told you that the 2,000 gallons of waste in his tank was not toxic, not notifiable, and harmless.
Yeah, that's right.
She's lying.
What you're calling a liar, mister? I'll get back to you in a minute.
You mustn't hold a conversation with the other defendant when you're giving evidence, Mrs. Cousins.
Giving himself airs. Nasty little smoothie.
Now, when Mr. Mays told you the waste was not toxic, had you any reason to think that he might not be telling the truth?
No, not then. Now I wouldn't believe him if he told me water's wet.
It didn't occur to you that he might claim it was harmless to get you to carry it away more cheaply?
Well, what for? They ain't exactly all on the bleeding breadline, any of them, are they?
Can you remember exactly what Mr. Mays said to you?
Well, not exactly. Do you know what you were saying on April the 14th? I mean, you talk, but you don't reckon to make notes. He said it wasn't toxic, and he showed us that list of what he said it was. Word for word, I can't remember no more than he can. Ordinary class 4 chemicals, he said.
Thank you, Mrs. Cousins.
Mrs. Cousins.
Oh, you're the sarky one, ain't you?
Mrs. Cousins, did you see this list that you claim Mr. Mays showed you?
I've just said so.
Where did he keep it?
I don't know where he keeps it. He had it.
Would it surprise you to learn that Mr. Mays did not have such a list?
No, it wouldn't surprise me, whatever he said.
Well, then, can you remember any of the chemicals or substances on this list that he's supposed to have shown you? Any of their names?
No.
Why not?
Well, when I was taking all my degrees at Oxford and Cambridge, they never taught me no chemistry.
You're saying that you don't know the names of any non-notifiable substances?
Yeah, I'm saying that.
Do you know the names of any toxic chemicals, then?
No, and I don't know the names of the Arsenal football team, neither.
But, Mrs. Cousins, you did say that you helped your husband in his business.
Yeah, I help him.
And it is his business, isn't it, to know the difference between harmless and toxic waste before he disposes of it safely?
His business, not mine.
But you help him. You go along to meetings with him. You talk prices and terms.
Well, we don't handle toxics now.
And perhaps that's just as well for the rest of us, if you can't recognise any of them.
I said you was sarky.
Now, you stopped handling dangerous waste when the Act came into force.
Yeah, well, we ain't got no tip.
And if you haven't got a tip of your own, you're out of business.
Near enough. With anything that's even mildly toxic. That's another thing wrong with the Act, isn't it?
What
well,
is?
tips.
What about them?
Well, there ain't all that many highly suitable.
Tips classified as highly suitable for toxic waste.
Well, right. Uses up all the best tips and squeezes us out.
You don't like the Act?
Well, all it's saying is, don't tell us your troubles, we can't help, just keep it out of the way of the public. If you ain't got nowhere to stick your rubbish, hard luck.
It squeezes you out. And you don't have a tip of your own, do you?
Only the kids' toy cupboard.
You dislike and disapprove of the law.
Oh, I don't know about that.
Enough to ignore it?
No.
But your husband has said that you don't earn money if you've got a tanker standing around idle, do you?
No.
And there must be a great temptation to carry a doubtful load or two.
The temptation is, mister, to give you a mouthful, but I ain't doing that neither.
And afterwards, of course, you would stick by your husband's story, stick by your husband and support his story.
No.
But you've already admitted that you would. You said that you'd lie for him.
I also said I ain't, though.
Thank you.
Oh. No cross-examination, my lord.
No re-examination, my lord.
Thank you, Mrs. Cousins. You may return to the dock.
I can't say as how it was a pleasure.
I call Michael Alistair Hayes.
Frankly, it all seems like some nightmare. That dreadful pair, people laughing at her rudeness, both of them snaring me in a net of lies. This has been hanging over me for weeks. I'm suspended from my job. Listening to them, I almost believe them. How can I prove the truth? I've racked my brains. I can't see how to prove it.
Well, let's try and leave it to the jury's good sense.
Yes. I'm sorry. I can hear my own voice. I've become over-emotional. I've been living with this for weeks. With them, it's just, what can we say to get ourselves out of trouble? With me, it's my life.
I can sympathise. Now, yours is an important and responsible job for a large company.
If I keep it?
Would it be impertinent to ask what sort of a salary you earn?
£5,150 a year.
A very responsible job.
Yes.
Now, this board meeting, which you were called before, did you really believe that you might be dismissed if you failed to reduce your department's costs?
Not actually dismissed, of course, but it was very strongly put to me. It's why I used the Cousins again.
Because they would give you a cheaper price?
Yes, and a few days before, Mrs. Cousins had telephoned me to ask why they had lost the job of clearing out our toxics tank. That's what made me think of them, put them in my mind.
She phoned you. What did you tell her?
I told her it was because they weren't set up properly to handle toxics since the Act became law. She said, don't worry about that. We can handle anything you've got. I remember that conversation when the tank was full, and I telephoned them and asked them in for a talk.
This was now the 14th of April.
Yes, it all happened so quickly. They were very keen to get the work again. He, Albert Cousins, has a tanker that was underemployed. With depreciation and hire purchase on a vehicle like that, you can't leave it lying around. They came with a double.
Now, why was there no witness to this talk? Where was your secretary, for example?
On leave, I'm afraid. Compassionate leave, because her mother was it. I gave her leave.
What was said at the meeting?
Well, there was no question of my telling them the contents were non-notifiable Class 4. I said, it's the old 2,000-gallon tank. It's near enough full with toxics. How much to dispose of it? That's what I said.
You said full with toxics?
I did. I swear I did. How can I prove that?
Now, this list you're supposed to have shown them, the list of chemicals and so on exempted from the Act.
I haven't even got a list like that. They've made that up.
Now, you must have had such a list, though. It's your job, isn't it, to know the difference between what's toxic and what isn't?
Yes, exactly. It is my job. I deal with chemicals all day and every day. I don't need a list. I know it. I had a list when the Act first became law, but it's been law a long time now. And I don't even know what happened to it. Our reference department would have a copy if ever I did need one.
Yes, of course. Now, what did Mr. and Mrs. Cousins reply when you asked them for their price?
They said £40. They said it straight off. They'd already talked about what they were going to quote. I asked them how they could do it so cheaply. They said it was a special price because they needed the work again, but they had a legal, authorised tip, and they'd take care of everything properly.
Did you ask them where this tip was?
Yes, and I wasn't surprised when they said that was their secret.
Why?
Well, if they'd had such a tip, it would have been worth money to them. They wouldn't be likely to tell other people who might use it up.
Now, did you discuss proper notification of the local authorities concerned?
Yes. And they said that they'd take care of everything. I don't want you to worry about that, Mr. Mays, Albert Cousins said. You don't have to think about that. That's what we're for. We just want you happy. Their words.
You do remember that conversation word for word?
I should have had every chance to remember it. I think every word is tattooed on my brain. We just want you happy.
And you had no suspicion at all?
I wasn't suspicious, no. Why should I be? They'd been working on and off for the company for years. I had no reason to think they'd be so stupid.
And they emptied the tanker the very same day?
Yes. It was none of my doing. Cousins simply came back that afternoon, pumped out the tank and took it away without saying a word to anyone. There wasn't even time to treat the contents.
You mean the contents of the tank should have been made less toxic?
Yes, before you dump anything like that, a chemist has to be brought in to see the record of contents and see what can be done to make it less toxic. I'd have laid that on when Cousins asked my permission to empty it. But he came back that very same day.
Now, why didn't you stop him when he came back?
I wasn't there, unfortunately. I was out on a call for the company. He had no business emptying a tank before he had an okay. He knew that.
Cousins knew he should have had your permission before pumping it off.
Yes. Otherwise, how could he know it had been checked and treated?
And he jumped the gun.
Yes.
Well, to summarise then, Mr. Mays, Mr. and Mrs. Cousins gave you clearly to understand that they had proper facilities legally to dispose of the liquid.
Yes.
And because Fulchester Metals had done business with them over a period of time, you had no reason to doubt their word.
I believed them.
And you had no reason to disbelieve them when they said that they would take care of notifying the local authorities.
I believed them. That was the only mistake I made.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Mays.
Now, Mr. Mays, you say your secretary was away on leave when you had your meeting with the Cousins?
Yes.
And in such an important and responsible job with such a large firm, you were given no replacement, no temporary?
She was only away for 2 days, I think. She doesn't sit in my office anyway.
I presume she was not on leave when Mrs. Cousins is supposed to have phoned you. Phoned to ask why they no longer had your contract.
No, she was not on leave then.
Good. And there is one part of your story that we can check. She can confirm that there was such a call.
My secretary doesn't listen to my telephone calls.
Your secretary doesn't seem to do anything very much. Was it she who lost your list of exempt chemicals?
I've explained about the list.
And you really expect us to believe that? Mr. Mays, do you seriously expect us to believe that a man in your position answers his own telephone, has a secretary who is rarely around when needed, and deals personally with every detail of a trifling £40 contract? It can only be that you dare not call any witness to support your story because you made very sure there would be none.
That's a monstrous suggestion.
Oh, Lord.
Miss Gibson, it has been quite clearly established that there is no useful witness who can be called. Now, what you are saying has got very prejudicial implications.
Very well, I withdraw it, my lord. He cannot call any witness. It is still quite extraordinary. I have no further questions.
Mr. Parsons?
My lord, Miss Gibson seems to have preempted so much of my cross-examination. There seems little left for me to do.
I'm sure you will manage, Mr. Parsons.
Yes, I'm sure I shall, my lord. Now, Mr. Mays, you see, one of you is telling the truth and one of you is making up a story.
I'm telling the truth.
You both sound so convincing. Let me make up a story for you and see if you prefer it. Now, could the conversation at the first meeting in your office possibly have gone something like this? You say to Cousins, Albert, I'm having trouble from my boss to cut costs, and you're having trouble making your tanker pay for itself. Why don't we get together? How about a quick £40 for emptying the toxic tanker, no questions asked?
No, that's not true.
No? But you did tell them it was toxic?
Yes.
Yes. Well then, what more logical than some mutually agreeable arrangement?
It wasn't like that at all.
You honestly believe they could make any sort of profit at all out of a price of just £40?
That was up to them.
You knew Seton Quarry was where your firm had dumped toxic waste for years before the act. Did it honestly never occur to you that of course that was the easy way, that of course that is where the cousins would tip that liquid?
No.
Or did you suggest it yourself?
No, certainly not. That would have been quite against the law.
Yes, it would, wouldn't it? No further questions, Mr. Mays.
You do know what conspiracy is, don't you, Mr. Mays?
Yes.
You know how serious it can be in law.
Yes.
Now, did you make 1 penny of profit out of this yourself?
No.
Were you ever really at risk of losing your job?
No.
So is it likely that you would enter into a conspiracy with people like Mr. and Mrs. Cousins?
No. It would be incredible.
Yes, that's exactly what it is, incredible. Now, have you told us one word from the witness box which was not the absolute truth?
I swear I haven't.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Mays.
Bleeding liar.
Now, let me recall for you, members of the jury, what Mr. Carter and his colleagues found when they analysed the waste dumped in Seton Quarry. They found chromic acid, cyanide, mercury, salts of cadmium, zinc oxides, zinc sulfates, lead and nickel. Now, Mr. Albert Cousins, who is no amateur at waste disposal, says he thought he was carrying suds oil. Now, I'll say no more about that. Now, lastly, let us consider Mr. Mays. He asked us to believe that the Cousins were going to do a £200 job for him for just £40 and do it legally. Now, he knew that they had no site of their own. He knew there was a real shortage of highly suitable sites, and he knew that for years before the act, the Cousins had tipped toxics at Seton Quarry. Now, he also says that Cousins had no right to empty the toxic tank without his permission. Therefore, does he also ask us to believe that the Cousins could drive into Fulchester Metals, empty a toxic tank without authority, and drive out again without being challenged? Now, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we have seen the two factions of the defence trying desperately to discredit each other. Now, one of them must be lying, and therefore one of them at least must be guilty. But I put it to you that the most likely explanation is that, in fact, all three are lying, that all three conspire together, and that you will therefore find all three guilty of conspiracy.
Now, moving on from the improbable charge of conspiracy. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you've just heard the stories of three very dissimilar people. There's Michael Mays on the one hand, an educated man, a shrewd man, an expert in all the intricacies of the world of business, on his own admission under considerable pressure from his superiors. Well, this being so, what more natural than that he should try to dispose of this waste in the manner least costly to his firm? Well, on the other hand, you have the Cousins, Albert and Martha Cousins, hard-working people, members of the jury, simply concerned in running a small family business. But we already know that decontamination of their tanker cost them more than the whole job was worth. Well, what are they to gain at that or any time from contravening the law? Now, finally, members of the jury, I want you to ask yourselves this question. How, in the course of a testimony quite remarkable for its lack of supportive facts, how was it possible for Mr. Mays to have not one witness, not one single item of proof of any kind to back up his story? One might almost feel the sympathy he asks for in these curious circumstances, were not the explanation so obvious. He had no witness because what he claims did not take place. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you must think carefully. You must weigh up these factors. When you've done so, I think you'll find only one possible course open to you. You must find Albert and Martha Cousins not guilty on both counts.
Now, the prosecution have suggested that Mr. Mays's motive for conspiracy was fear of the sack. But we've heard both the managing director of Fulchester Metals, called by the prosecution, and Mr. Mays himself positively and clearly deny that any threat of dismissal existed. Now, Mr. Mays had a well-paid and responsible job. He is obviously fully aware of the law and its penalties regarding waste disposal. And I put it to you that if he had conspired to break that law, he would have needed much stronger assurance that he wouldn't be found out. After all, the toxic waste was discovered almost immediately. In short, the prosecution's conspiracy theory suggests that Mr. Mays threw away his job in order to save his job. Illogical, even for them. Now, the suggestion that Mr. Mays conned the Cousins is even more preposterous. We have been seriously asked to believe that Mr. Mays told a professional waste disposal man who had regularly handled thousands and thousands of gallons of toxic waste that a tank full of highly poisonous chemicals contained, in fact, suds oil, and that this same professional waste disposal man didn't notice the difference when either filling or emptying 2,000 gallons of it. Michael Mays's only mistake was to trust this pair, and I would ask you to find this demonstrably sober and sincere man not guilty.
As you know, the three accused are charged firstly with conspiring to deposit toxic waste in defiance of the Act of 1972, secondly with unlawfully depositing that waste, and thirdly with failing to give proper notices to the local authorities. Now, before you can convict on the conspiracy charge, you must be satisfied beyond all reasonable doubt that these three people did indeed agree together illegally to deposit that waste. Now, on the other two charges, separate considerations apply to Mr. and Mrs. Cousins on the one hand and to Mr. Mays on the other. Mr. and Mrs. Cousins agree that they deposited the waste and that they gave no proper notices. But it is their defense that they relied on information given them by Mr. Mays that the waste was not toxic and that they have no reason to believe that this information was false. Now, you must acquit them if you believe on all the probabilities that their story is true. Now, Mr. Mays admits that the waste was deposited and that no notices were given, but he personally did not deposit the waste. He is charged with causing it to be deposited, and it is his case that he did not cause it to be deposited in Seddon Quarry. He believed it would be deposited in a proper, safe place. Now, unless you believe beyond all reasonable doubt that his story is untrue, you must acquit him. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, will you now retire to consider your verdict?
All stand.
The verdict.
Members of the jury, who shall speak as your foreman?
I shall.
Have you reached verdicts on all counts on which you are all agreed?
Yes.
On the charge of conspiring to unlawfully deposit poisonous waste, do you find the defendants guilty or not guilty?
Guilty.
Is that the verdict of you all?
Yes.
Do you find the defendant Albert Cousins guilty or not guilty of unlawfully depositing poisonous waste?
Guilty.
Is that the verdict of you all?
Yes.
Albert and Martha Cousins were also found guilty of depositing poisonous waste on land, and Michael Mays was found guilty of causing poisonous waste to be deposited. Mr. Justice Craig, in giving sentence, said that society had a growing concern that its quality of life should not be further polluted, and that its laws to safeguard this should not be flouted. Although this was a new act, he was going to impose the maximum penalties. Albert Cousins was sentenced to 18 months in prison, Martha Cousins to 3 months, and Michael Mays to 3 years. They were each fined £400 for not notifying the proper authorities. Join us next week when our cameras will be back to bring you another case in the Crown Court.